Hi guys, I'm Kasha. Welcome to our coffee times to talk horror together. And today, in honor of Old School April Readathon, I wanted to talk to you about 90s horror.
It's coffee time!
Many things happened in the 90s when it comes to horror movies and how the horror genre started to change. And I wanted to bring you some horror movies and some horror book recommendations. So basically what I have done is I have explored the flops and the successes from the 90s, and I'm bringing you here some book recommendations based on those movies. I'm also introducing you today to my new mug because I bought these recently on a trip that I did here in the Netherlands while my parents were here, and I absolutely had to get this mug. I had to. The 90s was a little bit kind of the decline of the franchises. Now, hear me out. There were a lot of franchises that were coming from better, successful years. Very popular franchises that didn't quite work in the 90s. It's not like all franchises died in the 90s. In fact, some came back later on with a bang, but there were some questionable sequels that came out in the 90s. In the 90s, we were promised the sixth and last installment in a Nightmare on Elm Street series. That was Freddy's Dead, the final nightmare, which is considered one of the worst ones from the franchise, and partly it is because of the way that they treated Freddy, which, you know, Freddy is basically this franchise. If you take away Freddy, if you take away Robert Englund, you basically do not have a Nightmare on Elm Street anymore. But lucky for us, Wes Craven came back to save us all and gave us a new nightmare. For this one, I would like to recommend you Dream Evil by Cameron Kane, and this is just a very short novella, but it kind of fits the premise. We are on Halloween night in 1988, and we follow a girl that realizes that the monster that has been plaguing her nightmares might actually be more real than she anticipated. Our main character is called Tuesday, and she seems to be a regular school student, and she likes, you know, parties and other things, hanging out with her friends. But there is something that nobody else knows about her, and that is that when she goes to sleep, she always has this recurring dream that puts her inside of this really creepy house. As Halloween is approaching, her nightmares get more and more intense. And of course, we will find her fighting for her life against the monster that plagues her nightmares. Another big and popular horror franchise is Friday the 13th, and this franchise was also going through some changes in the 90s. Basically, after a very disappointing release, which was Jason Takes Manhattan, Paramount decided to sell the rights to New Line Cinema, and they came up with a new movie that, well, at the time, it didn't really work. I think with time, more people appreciate it, but at the time, it was a big flop. I'm talking about Jason Goes to Hell, and part of why this movie was critiqued so much is because it deviated a lot from the original plot, from the original movie, from what it makes, you know, Friday the 13th, what it is as a franchise, and so a lot of people hated it a lot when it came out. Now I think more people kind of see why they were trying to do something fresh, but it's still, you know, a hit or miss for a lot of people. And for this movie, I would like to recommend you also a book, of course. For the Friday the 13th franchise, I would recommend you Camp Slaughter by Dan Padavona. This is pitched as a slasher story in the veins of Halloween, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Friday the 13th, so you already know what you're getting yourself into. This is, however, a little bit more intense than other recommendations that I do have in this list. So there's gonna be a lot of gore and, you know, body parts, severed heads, you know, stuff like that. So just keep that in mind. We follow a group of young counselors that is trying to rebuild Camp Black Bear, and they will find that there is a killer on the loose in the woods next to this camp. The killer is hunting them, and obviously he is not going to stop until every single one of them is dead. The vehicles have been destroyed, The radios don't work. They are miles away from the next town and the sheriff promised them that they will be safe, but can they make it out alive? The 90s also brought us two different Halloween movies that could not be more different from each other. Halloween is another franchise that, especially in the last years, has kind of had a revival, even though I am not a huge fan of the new trilogy. In fact, I wish they would just stop. In 1995, we got Halloween: The Curse of Michael Myers, and this movie was actually an effort to recover from the disaster that was the first sequel to the original, which was not really well received. 3 years later, they went for nostalgia vibes and they decided to do Halloween age 20, and they tried, you know, to bring back Laurie in hopes to please the fans, and opinions on this movie are quite divided. Age 20 basically ignored everything except for the first two films and tried to kind of revamp the franchise. For this movie, I would like to also recommend you a book, of course. I have for you Night of the Prowler by John Readathon. Zoe is an 18-year-old girl that is trying to save for college, so she accepts a job at a gas station. Her job is simple, you know, restocking the shelves, getting out the trash, mopping the floors, but also in this case today, surviving the night. She's used to the creeps and other kind of weirdos that come at night to the gas station, but then she hears in the radio that there is actually a serial killer on the loose. This suspected serial killer has also just escaped a mental institution. This is a suspenseful as well as a violent slasher reminiscent of the classics that we all love. This one has a disclaimer for blood and gore, and it is advised to check trigger warnings and the level of, you know, horror that you can take before you dive into it. Apart from the franchise, the 90s had a very specific focus, and that was true crime. People started to get really invested with true crime thanks to the big expansion of TV channels, TV shows, and a lot of them were talking about true crime cases, and you were able to get all of this information sitting from your couch at home, and people became really invested with those stories. The horror genre is something that has always fascinated us because we hope those are things that we would never experience ourselves, but we are very curious to learn about why and how people would do these things, and we love to consume it. Especially a lot of people like me find comfort in horror and true crime documentaries. So because of these, there was a surge on horror movies, horror/thriller movies that portrayed serial killers. We have to talk, of course, of Silence of the Lambs, and in this story Hannibal Lecter helps an FBI agent to actually catch another killer. So you have a killer helping to catch another one. In this case, we are all a little bit like Clarice. We all want to know the motives, the impulse that these killers have, the why, the how, and we can all see ourselves in Clarice. Now, there is, of course, books, and that's where the movie came from, but I have recommended them before, so I just wanted to briefly talk about the movie and the impact that it had so that I could recommend you another similar thriller. With this movie, they were trying to also give you a cautionary tale to be careful on the neighbor that is just next door. And as for the book, I would like to recommend you Eeny Meeny by M.J. Arledge. Two people are kidnapped, imprisoned, and left with a gun and with a decision. One of them gets to leave, the other one does not. Detective Helen Grace is the one in charge to catch this killer before more people are brutally murdered. Basically, she is able to talk in this case to the survivors because the killer always kidnaps two people, puts them together in a room, and only one of them gets to walk out of there alive. So of course, in this case, this serial killer does leave out survivors, and that is where our detective starts the investigation. This is your typical thriller, but with the emphasis on serial killers, and that is one of my favorite, you know, kind of subplots when it comes to thrillers. I love thrillers about serial killers. Another movie that was a game changer was Seven. Now, this is more of a thriller than a horror perhaps, but this movie was an exploration of evil. The 90s was a time where people realized that reality was a lot uglier than we had assumed it was, and you can see in this movie the grittiness, the filthiness of the film, and it also allows the audience to kind of investigate and try to figure out what's going on and who could do such horrible things. The movie was really well made, and it is a movie that I think stuck with a lot of people because of certain things that happened in the movie, certain twists that were quite bold and that were quite, you know, extreme for the regular, I would say, thriller moviegoer. Maybe it was a little bit more intense that they had bargained for, but it was definitely a game changer. And of course, I'm gonna pair this movie as well with a book, and I'm gonna pair it with Velocity by Dean Koontz. Bill is a normal guy, has a very ordinary life, but one day when he is leaving his 8-hour shift at the bar, he finds a paper on the windshield of his car. The note says that if he does not take that note to the police, he's going to shoot and kill a teacher, a school teacher. But if he does take the note to the police, he's going to kill instead an elderly woman that is heavily involved with charity work. So he has to choose who gets to live and who has to die. Bill, of course, assumes this is a prank, this is a joke, and he knows that nobody has been killed, there has been nothing in the news, so he feels like it's not his responsibility to do anything with the note. He kind of discards it. And then the news comes that a school teacher has been shot. Then he receives another note, and the notes will come faster and faster each time, asking him to make an impossible decision. The 90s also allowed horror movies to evolve, and we got some horror movies that definitely were a game changer for the horror fans. And especially there was one that I've talked about before, like recently, and that is the Blair Witch Project. This movie, I think nobody could anticipate what it became. They did a wonderful marketing campaign. Everybody that went to watch this movie thought it was a legit documentary, or almost everybody. And it was definitely a movie that changed the found footage genre and revived it, and after it many other movies came. I've talked before about, you know, how I went to watch this to the cinema with my dad, and that was a great experience for me. I don't know if he enjoyed it as much as I did, but I definitely did. Now, not long ago, I posted a video on some, you know, horror books and horror movies about the woods. So if you want to check that out, I will link it down below. But I also, of course, wanted to give you a quick recommendation that was not mentioned in that video, so it's a brand new recommendation. It is called Found, an anthology of found footage horror stories. And I love the premise of this one because we follow basically 18 authors that disappeared, and when they reappeared, they wrote the stories of what happened to them. And so they're all kind of found footage stories, short horror stories, and I thought this would be also a really fun read if you guys love that subgenre of found footage horror. Something else that became really popular in the 90s when it comes to horror movies was Japanese horror. And Japanese horror, I've always said, you know, those type of movies are the movies that really creep me out, like The Ring, The Grudge, Audition. Like, there's something about Japanese horror and Korean and Chinese horror that really gets me, and Japanese horror became really popular in the 90s. I urge you to watch all the originals because I know maybe some of you are only familiar with the remakes, the American remakes of these movies, but I do encourage you to go back and watch the originals because in my opinion, they are way creepier. The Ring, Ringu is one of my favorite Japanese horror movies. I watched it when I was young and I was studying at university. They were doing some sort of like little Asian movie festival and they played this movie. I didn't know what I was getting myself into and I was absolutely blown away by it. I was also horrified by it and I have a really good memory of this movie. And there's also a book, but in this case I wanted to recommend you something different, and I just finished a novella the other day that gave me sort of the same vibes. That is Scanlines by Todd Gaisling, and this is a novella that I picked up for Old School April and I really enjoyed it. But Let me tell you, check the trigger warnings. This novella does deal with suicide and it is quite violent and extreme, so just for you to know. But it follows a group of friends that in the 80s they were trying to download a porno film, but instead they downloaded the urban legend, the Duncan tapes. Everybody thought that that was a legend, that that tape didn't exist, but they came across it in the 80s, they watched it, and since then their lives have become a nightmare. In the tape we can see a congressman that shoots himself in the head in live television. So we follow how these guys, after watching the tape, keep seeing this guy's face everywhere, is hunting them, they have nightmares about him, and the people that watch the tape is rumored that also have accidents and die. So it does have a little bit of the Ring vibes. Also the Duncan tape at the beginning, you know, in the 80s was a VHS tape that was passed around. So it does have kind of that vibe, but it is a little bit different on the nature of the origin of the tape and everything. Of course, we don't have Sadako here. But I would say if you like The Ring and you don't mind horror that is a little bit more disturbing and intense, you should pick up this novella. And last but not least, I wanted to talk about another of those horror movies in the 90s that changed the horror genre, and that is Scream. Wes Craven gave us a movie that changed the horror genre, not because they completely reinvented slasher movies, but it was the very first time that we got a slasher movie that defied the tropes and also became meta. Like, we have him to thank for what we now have, this meta, this kind of like self-awareness in horror movies. He was a pioneer on that, and we got that with Scream, apart from, like I said, defying the tropes of slasher movies, and that's why it had such a big, huge impact. He embraced all the tropes, he gave us many of the tropes, but he also balanced it with humor and self-awareness, and it was the perfect formula. For this one, I would like to recommend you a book from an author that also normally combines humor, self-awareness, and horror, and that is Grady Hendrix. I'm here to recommend you The Final Girls Support Group. As you can tell by the title, this is a support group, so almost like an AA meeting. We have here a meeting of final girls that meet to talk about their experience, their trauma, and how they are coping with life. So everything is going well, you know, we get introduced to the girls and they're talking about their experience and what happened to them and how they became a final girl and how that has affected their life now. But then the final girls start to get targeted and killed one by one, so somebody is coming back to finish the job. This has been so far one of my favorite Grady Hendrix books, and this is why I will also like to recommend it to you, and also because obviously Neve Campbell gave us Sidney Prescott, who has been one of the most well-known final girls, and she is still standing as of today, and we shall see what happens with the Scream franchise. Officially, allegedly, she has signed up for Scream 7, so we might see her come back to reprise her role as Sidney Prescott soon, but nevertheless, she has been one of the most well-known final girls in horror movie history. This was my video on 90s horror. I hope that you enjoyed me pairing some of the most well-known, for good or bad, horror movies from the 90s with some horror books. I hope that you enjoyed this video. Let me know down below which is the horror movie that was a game changer for you. It doesn't have to be a 90s horror movie, just the one that impacted you the most. Thank you guys as always so much for watching, and I hope to see you all as always in our next coffee time. Bye!